Okay, I think we can get started. I'll expect a few more people to come in as I'm doing introductions. So, on behalf of the Harvard Club of Southern California, I want to thank you for joining us in this Harvard Speak for LA virtual event. The Harvard Club of Southern California is one of the largest
Just
and
a little bit, not too much.
Harvard alumni clubs in the world, and we're delighted to be able to sponsor this event. My name is Neil Morgenbesser. I'm Harvard College class of '86 and the director of Harvard Speak LA program, which brings the opportunity to the broader alumni community for some intellectually and academically stimulating interactions with some of the most renowned Harvard faculty members. Our 2025 talks so far have included Dr. Loretta Mickley on wildfires, astronomy professor Avi Loeb on evidence of extraterrestrial intelligence, law school professor Randall Kennedy on his upcoming book on the demise of Jim Crow, and retired government professor Harvey Mansfield. Our next event will be on June 5th with sociology and government professor Theda Skocpol, former dean of the Graduate School of Arts and Sciences, speaking on America's democracy and governing crisis. And we have future commitments from English professor Stephen Greenblatt, psychology professor Stephen Pinker, and Kennedy School professor Tariq Masood. So stay tuned for those. Today, we're extremely excited to be able to hear from Professor Edward J. Hall. Ned Hall is the Norman E. Villamere Professor of Philosophy, Director of Undergraduate Studies, and former chairman of the Philosophy Department at Harvard University. Professor Hall graduated from Reed College in 1987, and he earned his Ph.D. in philosophy at Princeton. He taught at MIT until 2005 when he came to Harvard. Professor Hall works on a range of topics in metaphysics and epistemology that overlap with the philosophy of science. Professor Hall is a 2020 winner of the Phi Beta Kappa Prize for Excellence in Teaching at Harvard. In 2019, when Professor Hall introduced his Gen Ed class Reclaiming Argument, Logic as a Force for Good, it was dedicated to helping students, quote, come to see argument not primarily as a contest to be won or lost, but as something that should be reclaimed for a more noble purpose, building genuine understanding between people, even across profound differences of viewpoint. With his motto, logic makes fools of us all, Professor Hall said he was aiming to help students identify, quote, why public disagreement so often seems to get us nowhere, unquote, and to provide them with skills and tools for addressing disagreement more effectively and respectfully. Professor Hall will discuss the current climate of discourse on campus, as well as ideas and initiatives underway to improve it. One final quote from Professor Hall, quote, I firmly believe that philosophical discourse always goes better if the parties involved resolutely avoid any burden-shifting maneuvers, and that teaching always goes better if you bring cookies. Because this is a Zoom event, we are unfortunate that we will have to focus on the former and not the latter. Please join me in welcoming Professor Hall to Harvard Speak LA.
Thanks, Neil. Really appreciate that. The cookies, by the way, that got started way back when I was teaching an ancestor of the Reclaiming Argument course, which was more of a straight up logic course at the time. And every week gave the students a test. I called it a quiz, but they were really tests. And my graduate student teaching fellow convinced me to soften the blow a bit by bringing cookies to the test days. That was a good idea, and that began a tradition. I just want to add that in addition to the motto, logic makes fools of us all, the other catchphrase for that course is 90% of critical thinking is emotion regulation. That's probably the catchphrase that's going to be more relevant to our discussion today. Anyways, it's great to be here. Thank you all for coming. I'm really, really interested to sort of launch into discussion with you and to hear your questions about what's going on at Harvard, what problems we face, what we can do better. I'm going to pull up some slides to share. Let me see if this is going to work okay. Yeah, one sec. Everybody see those okay?
Yep.
Okay, great. Let me just, okay, so I'll try to keep track of time and just like talk through some ideas for, half an hour at most 40 minutes, because I really think the Q&A is going to be some of the most interesting part of our evening together. I'm going to, in these remarks, I'm going to lay out what I think of as a kind of philosophical background to the practical questions about how to build a culture of intellectual vitality at Harvard. So we'll save for Q&A a kind of in-depth discussion of what I see on the ground, the kinds of efforts that I see underway right now. And part of the reason for that is I think well, it'll become clear as we go along, but I think we need to have a clear idea of like what the end goal is in order to facilitate the right sorts of efforts on campus. So this talk grew out of an earlier version in which I was trying to think through why we should care about free speech on college campuses. And my thinking about it has morphed, and I still think free speech is pretty important, but I think it's important because it's in service of something else, where there's something else we have a label for it. We call it intellectual vitality. It's not totally clear what that means, and I'll try to add some sort of substance to the label as we go along. But a good way into our topic is not to do what I think often happens, or follow a path that I think is often followed in conversations about colleges and what's good and bad on them, which is to focus on things like cancel culture and protests and what do we think about them? Are they good or bad? Should they be regulated? Are they signs of like things going wrong, or for that matter, right on college campuses? Those kinds of topics and now we can add DEI to the list thanks to our president. Those kinds of topics gather a lot of attention and generate a lot of noise, but I tend to think they distract us from a pretty important question that that we need to get right, and that is in a way the more sort of primary question to focus on, which is like, what is the point of colleges and universities at all? Like, why should a well-functioning society have them? That's a kind of, for us, that's a kind of elementary question. And in the current political climate, it's starting to feel like a more existential question because, you know, there are narratives out there according to which there is no good point to have colleges and universities, at least not ones like Harvard. Now, maybe you can have vocational ones. No. And in particular, colleges and universities that pride themselves on providing a liberal arts education, I think urgently need to have something clear and compelling to say about what they contribute to society as a whole, what distinctive mission they fulfill. So we can start with this question: why do we have colleges and universities? Now, there's some answers that I think, some of them good, some of them a bit more cynical, but for our purposes, I want to set them aside. So one good answer is you want locations that sort of where the production of knowledge and understanding can be concentrated. That focuses on the research mission of colleges and especially universities. That's interesting and important. It's also something I want to set aside here because I really want to be focusing on the teaching mission. So as far as the teaching mission is concerned, you might think, oh, well, one reason to have colleges and universities is to prepare young people to do what we nerdy academics do. And that's part of it. Like, the research mission is important, so you need to train the next generation of researchers. But honestly, at Harvard, it's a small percentage of our students who go on to graduate school with an aim to joining the academic research community. So we'll set that aside too. Then there are other somewhat more cynical answers: preparing young people to be good little capitalist worker bees, or credentialing. If I'm being fully honest, I will say we have students who come to Harvard because they want the credential primarily, and they don't lose that desire in favor of more noble desires before they graduate, which always makes me sad. But fortunately, we have lots of like passionate, committed students who want to change the world as well. So I think we should set that one aside too. So at this point, you might think, well, let's ask the colleges and universities themselves what the mission is, but especially the educational mission. And I sort of spent an afternoon hunting around on the web to see various different kinds of mission statements and found lots of high-minded language. I won't go through all of the examples because I want to be mindful of the time, but I'll give you some. Here's what the experts say. We'll skip Carleton. I'll go straight to, here's what Swarthmore says, for example. Swarthmore College provides learners of diverse backgrounds a transformative liberal arts education grounded in rigorous intellectual inquiry and empowers all who share in our community to flourish and contribute to a better world, which sounds great, but is a little bit lacking in detail. I'll skip through Reed's. Reed's is much more nerdy. My favorite, in some ways, was Williams. Also somewhat lacking in detail, as you can see, but high on poetry. In the gentle light of the Berkshire Hills, Williams pursues a bold ambition to provide the finest possible liberal arts education. If the goal is immodest, it is also bracing, elevating the sights and standards of every member of the community, encouraging them to keep faith with the challenge inscribed on the college's gates, climb high, climb far. Also, if you're in the right mood, at least, could be very inspiring, but not super actionable. Like if you're thinking like, okay, how do I know whether my institution is fulfilling the mission? You're not going to get a lot of guidance from this statement of the mission. I realize there's a risk of confirmation bias here, but I kind of like Harvard's current one. The mission of Harvard College is to educate the citizens and citizen leaders for our society. We do this through our commitment to the transformative power of a liberal arts and sciences education. And it goes on to break that down a bit, like distinguishing an intellectual and a personal transformation. And closing with the line, from this, we hope that students will begin to fashion their lives by gaining a sense of what they want to do with their gifts and talents, assessing their values and interests, and learning how they can best serve the world. So what I like about that is a combination of vision of what's like sort of good for the student, what allows a young person to better flourish, but combined with an understanding that we want our students to go on and contribute in some meaningful way to society as well. So that's great. But again, when I read something like this, I think like, okay, I want that unpacked in some way that allows me to see what it is about the kind of liberal arts education that Harvard offers, which it makes it particularly well suited to achieving this aim. Like, why do you need college, in particular, a liberal arts college education, to undergo the kinds of transformations that are being gestured at here? And that's not spelled out here. And I don't mean that as a criticism. It's supposed to be short and inspiring. It's not supposed to be like, an action plan. But in my own thinking about this, I was really struck by how it's not obvious ahead of time, either what is distinctive about a liberal arts education, like what do we mean by that, as opposed to the kind of thing you could get by reading a lot of good books or taking a lot of good online classes, or maybe having some tutors as well. And why a liberal arts education is distinctively valuable, valuable in such a way that it makes sense to have institutions that are expert, at least ideally expert at providing it. Okay, so I'm going to give a partial answer, and we'll see what you think, and then sort of draw some tentative conclusions from that answer, and that'll set the stage for a sort of, I think, richer conception of what intellectual vitality or a culture of intellectual vitality might be, and that in turn will set the stage for a kind of what I hope will be a robust discussion of like, okay, how do we actually build it? How do you do it? And what are the particular challenges? So I'm going to pivot first. So what comes next might look like it's out of left field, but you'll see the connection soon enough. So here's what in the psych literature is often called a stumper. I'm going to tell you a little story. Many of you will have seen this story or some version of it before. The example will work better if it's brand new to you. So if you have seen it before, pretend you haven't, or go back to try to remember what it was like when you first came across this. So here's a little story, we'll call it The Surgeon. A father and his son are involved in a horrific car crash, and both are rushed to the hospital. When the child is brought into the operating theater, the surgeon stops short and says, "I can't operate on this boy, he's my son." Question is, how can this be? Okay, so we won't pause to discuss this. Some of you will know the answer. I will say that when I encounter students, when I give this to students who have not heard this before, it's kind of charming because they think for a minute and they say, "Oh, I know, it's a gay couple." That's odds on the favorite answer for people who've not already encountered this, which, in some ways shows to my, the progressive side of me, a certain kind of progress. Like, okay, that's great. But in some ways, I think like, okay, there hasn't been so much progress because, there's this very simple and obvious answer. Well, at least obvious once you see it. I will say it wasn't obvious to me the first time I heard this, which is the surgeon is the boy's mother. And what's the point here? Well, I'm not trying to play gotcha here. No, no surprise that we all have sort of inbuilt biases that shape how we think of the space of what's possible. What I want to draw attention to is a point that was emphasized in the PhD dissertation of this woman, who's a former graduate student of mine, who's now a philosopher at University of Vermont, Elise Miller-Larsen, who wrote her PhD dissertation on the epistemology of ignorance. And she begins with a kind of, simple but sort of very important and like surprisingly powerful point, which is that there's a kind of ignorance that consists not in a mere lack of knowledge, but in overlooking a possibility. Ignorance in this sense is a kind of cognitive blind spot. And it turns out, and I think I won't try to summarize her dissertation for you, but I think she makes good on this idea in her dissertation, that understanding the nature, sources, and consequences of this kind of ignorance is critically important to epistemology, the study of knowledge and understanding. So if we go back to the example of the surgeon, it's a nice example to illustrate the idea, right? Because it's just a thought experiment. And you hear the story, you hear the question, like, how is this possible? And for many of us, certainly for me, when I first heard this, a perfectly reasonable answer to that question was just out of view, was cognitively out of view. And that's a nice, crisp, easy to grasp example of the phenomenon that Miller-Larsen has in mind. And just to like help bring it into a bit sharper focus, when we use the word ignorance, sometimes we use the word ignorance to mean a mere lack of knowledge. So for example, you are all ignorant of what I had for breakfast this morning. At least I hope so, because if not, there's that's a little creepy, right? You're ignorant in the sense you don't know what I had for breakfast this morning. That kind of ignorance, again, the ignorance that is merely lacking a certain piece of knowledge, is not particularly interesting. We have lots of it, but as a subject matter, ignorance of that form is completely commonplace and not particularly worrisome, at least not as per se. Like certain specific instances of it might be worrisome. Like it might be worrisome if, say, too many of our citizens don't know how many branches of government we have. So it's not that lack of certain kinds of knowledge isn't worrisome, but lack of knowledge in general as a phenomenon is something we should just expect given our limitations. But the kind of ignorance that consists in overlooking a possibility is different in kind, I think. That's the kind of ignorance that can compromise inquiry. So in general, what do we do when we conduct inquiry? We have some question that's raised either in our own minds or maybe in some group we're in. And for inquiry to go well, one crucial first step is that the inquirers have a good, sufficiently rich and accurate map of the possible answers to the question. And if inquiry begins by shoving some of those possible answers off stage, in the way that meant for many of us, the answer, it's the boy's mother, that's who the surgeon is off stage when we face that question, how can this be? Then inquiry gets compromised. And that itself has can have lots of pretty terrible downstream effects. So the kind of ignorance that consists in cognitive blind spots, unlike mere lack of knowledge, can have profound effects on inquiry. That's one of the reasons I think it's so important. And we could summarize by saying, to the extent that we're unable to diagnose, guard against, and combat ignorance of this sort, this kind of cognitive blind spot ignorance, will be worse inquirers. Okay. So I'm just going to sort of like wax philosophical a bit about like what ignorance is, how it can arise at the individual level and at the group level, just to fill out our understanding of it a bit. And it's a big topic, so I'm just going to hit some I think some key points, but just a few of them. When we think about ignoring a possibility, there are at least two distinct ways that can happen. One is you fail to notice it. That's what happened to me the first time I heard the surgeon story. The other is you fail to take it seriously. I will say that did not happen to me the first time I heard the surgeon story, and it probably wouldn't happen to you either. But you could imagine someone who hears the surgeon story and is like, I don't know, I don't understand how this could happen. And you say, oh, it's the boy's mother. And they say, oh, come on, women can't be surgeons, right? That would be the second way of ignoring that possible answer. And in a way, the fail to take it seriously is the more common and more dangerous species of this kind of ignorance. So one initial point to make about this kind of ignorance is that, of course, individuals can be ignorant, but groups can as well. And that can be a novel phenomenon. So One way a group can be ignorant of some possibilities, just that every member of the group is ignorant of that possibility. That's one way it can happen. But social groups can also exhibit a different kind of ignorance. It can be that social forces within a group prevent a certain possible answer to some question from being taken up in group level reasoning. There's some question before the group. There's some answer that maybe as an outsider you think like, oh, well, that group really should like take that answer seriously. But social forces make that impossible. And we'll talk a little bit more in a second about what those can be like. And here, you know, when I was thinking about this point, when I was first drawing up this talk and thinking about examples, I also noticed something else because I did a little sort of, ask myself a question. Can I think of some, can I think of examples of groups that are ignoring some possibility and ignoring some possibility because of their internal social dynamics? And you might all try this right now. I mean, if we were together live, I would query you about this, but I'm not going to do that right now. But just try thinking of an example of a group that's ignoring some possible answer to some maybe important question and ignoring it because of its internal social dynamics. Okay. And then you can ask yourself whether you did what I did, which was, did you think of your group, a group that you belong to, or did you think of some other group? And I will say in my own case, of course, I thought of some other group. Right. And that's an interesting phenomenon, right? Like the kind of ignorance we're talking about, cognitive blind spot ignorance, it's not a very comfortable thing to attribute it to yourself or to groups that you identify with, as opposed to mere lack of knowledge. Like, I don't have any problem saying, I don't know what you had for breakfast either. That doesn't bother me. But of course, it does bother me to think, oh, there's some question about which I have blind spots, or there's some question about which me and my people collectively have blind spots because of our own social dynamics. That creates a bit more friction and tension. And that's worth noting, because that means that ignorance of ignorance is both possible and can be difficult to spot, right? So one possibility I may not be live to is the possibility that I'm not live to possibilities, right? And that can certainly happen at the group level as well. And you've probably all been familiar with group dynamics where not only is there ignorance, but where there's utter ignorance of that very fact. Like, okay. So let's talk a little bit about mechanisms of production. I'll sort of go through this a bit more quickly. I think there are ways that ignorance can be produced at the individual level that are worth noting. One is a kind of threat avoidance. So if we contrast two cases, like suppose you actually threaten me, you do something that manifests hostility towards me. A reasonable response I might have is to avoid you. Okay. But contrast that with a case where you don't threaten me, but your idea does. You float an idea in conversation that I find threatening. You don't manifest any hostility towards me, though. Well, avoiding you isn't going to help. Like, your idea is still there. What else might help? If I want the feeling of threat to go away. That's all I care about. I'm not saying this is not a healthy response, by the way, but suppose it is my response. I just want the threat to go away. What can I do? Well, I can avoid your idea. I can shunt it aside. I can maybe do so by just finding some rationalization for dismissing it out of hand. Or, and you know, we've all seen this in conversation and interaction, I can convert my hostility towards your idea into hostility towards you. And that happens, I think, all too frequently. And it's something that in the, you know, on campus, we absolutely need to find ways to guard against. But whatever method I use, if my primary aim is to avoid that feeling of threat, however I do it, I'm going to make myself more ignorant in the sense we have in mind here. I'm going to increase my blind spots. I'm not going to reduce them. There are other things, ways that ignorance can be produced too. If I think that I have higher status than you, that can make it very easy to ignore your ideas. I can use my status to deny you standing to be heard. I can treat you with condescension, derision, or contempt. I can use my status to take advantage of conversation stopping moves. There's lots of ways in which differences in status can reinforce blind spot ignorance. And that's in a way more insidious than the kind of ignorance that's due to threat avoidance, because it's harder to notice when it's happening. Now, if I consider myself your superior, at least in some domain, and you float some idea that I'm not, interest that I don't want to take seriously, I can frictionlessly tell myself like, oh, like I know better than you. And so not even get to the point of feeling a threat that I want to avoid. Okay. So at the group level, there's one mechanism of production that I think is worth highlighting. I think there are lots. I think, in fact, it's a quite complicated and interesting question, how ignorance can be reinforced within the social dynamics of a group. But there's one way that I think we've all seen this happen, which is ignorance is used as a kind of policing mechanism. So we're all familiar with the fact that for many groups, there's a question of what you have to be like to be a member in good standing of the group. And sometimes a specific form of that question is, what do you have to believe, or at least outwardly espouse, in order to be a member in good standing of some group? So it might be that in order to be a member in good standing of some group, I need to set aside, I need to dismiss, or in the sense I'm using this evening, be ignorant of the possibility that P, where P is some claim. Ignorant of it by overlooking it, or maybe by dismissing it out of hand. So, to give you an example that's close to home, the one group I belong to, which is like college professors at Harvard, we tend to believe that the teaching we do is valuable and important. And it's not easy for us to seriously entertain the possibility that it's not, right? But we should, like, if we want to be honest in dealing with in addressing the question, what's the value of what we have to offer? One live answer is nothing, right? It's not an answer that any of us are comfortable with, no. And to some extent, the dynamics of the professoriate is such that, like, you're not really supposed to take that answer seriously. You're not supposed to voice it, no, in polite company. But it can get worse than that. You could be in a group where not only are you meant to overlook or dismiss a certain possibility, so it's not okay to raise the question, could P, this is just my generic label for whatever the possibility is in question, could that be true? Like, not only is it bad to ask that question, maybe so bad that you might get kicked out if you seriously press that question. That's why I say it's anathema. So it might be that it's not only is it anathema to ask, could P be true, but it's also anathema to ask, why in our group is it anathema to ask whether P could be true? Or why is it anathema to ask why it is anathema to ask whether P could be true? Or for that matter, why is it anathema to ask why it is anathema to ask why it is anathema to ask whether P could be true? It's worth sort of thinking about that. Like, I've definitely been in groups not only where certain views are kind of understood in common to be off the table, but where querying why that is so, why should those views be off the table in our group? That's also off the table. And querying why that should be so is off the table, and so on. And that, I think, is a dangerous place to be. It's like anathema all the way down. So the group level ignorance kind of protects itself by making the question of why that ignorance should be in place itself something that's not capable of being addressed in a serious way. Okay. So if we ask, like, how can you push back against ignorance? There's a lot to say about this. I tend to, I think there are a lot of kind of intellectual and social and even emotion regulation oriented virtues one needs to cultivate in order to push back against ignorance, either in oneself or in groups to which one belongs. But, one virtue in particular, I think, stands out, which is a kind of curiosity that's egalitarian in its focus. So at the individual level, I can strive to be curious about what I'm missing. I can strive to be curious about an idea I find threatening. So try and cultivate the attitude of responding to the feeling of threat from your idea, not by immediately like going nuclear on you, but by hitting pause for a second and saying, the fact that I feel threatened suggests that there's something worth exploring here. I can strive to be curious about why I find some idea threatening. That just goes hand in hand with what I just said. And this is what I really emphasize in the reclaiming argument course. I can strive to not automatically treat those who disagree with me, or at least disagree with me about something that I care deeply about, as stupid, evil, or deranged, SAID for short. That's the acronym we use in the course. And that can be surprisingly hard to do. It's very easy. I find this reaction in myself constantly to encounter someone defending some view that I don't like, or maybe that I strongly dislike, or that runs counter to something I hold dear, and immediately treat them as like, well, there must be some combination of stupid, evil, or deranged. There must be some mix of that. And unsurprisingly, conversations don't go so well if you're treating your conversational partner that way. So at the group level, we can also cultivate norms that encourage the virtue of curiosity, and we can set up structures designed to bring overlooked possibilities to our attention. And those two bullet points are really important when I think about like structuring a classroom environment. All right, I'm gonna just a little keeping track of time. I'm gonna like try to speed up a little bit. Just to sort of summarize where we are so far, we said, here's this question: what's the point of colleges and universities, especially when it comes to educating young people? We saw like you can find lots of high-minded rhetoric, some of it quite attractive about this, but the rhetoric leaves something to be desired. It doesn't give you a kind of concrete sense of what is distinctive about the kind of education we offer that makes it especially valuable. And the detour through discussion of ignorance, I think, allows us to identify one thing. It's not, I don't claim it's the only thing, but one common thread that you can tease out of many of the mission statements that I think is more actionable, and it's this. A liberal arts education should, among other things, aim to equip students with the skills, knowledge, and habits of mind they need to diagnose, guard against, and combat ignorance, both in themselves and in the groups to which they do or will belong. So that's part of what we're in the business of, is teaching our students anti-ignorance. We're an anti-ignorance institution. And that's surely not all. If you're a student, you should also learn some stuff. Like learn some economics or some physics or philosophy. But I think this is one common thread that we want, ideally, all of our students to come out with. Like we want to build their ability to diagnose, guard against, and combat ignorance. And it's worth emphasizing, not just in themselves, but in the groups to which they do or will belong. So there's really a social element to this as well. I think this is an important part of a liberal arts education, and an important reason why a well-functioning society needs institutions that provide such an education. So if we think about how to implement it, this is where I think it's good to pivot back to talk about speech on campuses and what norms of free speech, like what it means to say that free speech should be valued on campus and why. And here, I think I've been helped in my thinking a lot by some work by a political philosopher named Teresa Bejan. This is Teresa, who draws a distinction between two very different meanings of free speech. And this goes back, she thinks, to the Greeks. She distinguishes between parrhesia, which for short is freedom from fear of retaliation for the content of what you say. And very often when people talk about free speech, this is what they have in mind. You should be able to like float ideas without getting hated on, without getting punished for doing so. And that's certainly very important. But there's another kind of freedom as well, which is the freedom you enjoy. She calls this isagoria, or actually I have no idea how to pronounce the Greek, so let's just pretend that's right. Which is the freedom you enjoy when you have the standing to have your speech be heard and engaged with. And heard and engaged with doesn't just mean responded to somehow or other. It means you have isagoria when your ideas are taken seriously, ideally in a spirit of egalitarian curiosity about their merits. Doesn't mean they're agreed with, but it means they're taken seriously. And Parisian isagoria are really quite logically distinct. If we were all together in a room, each of us shouting at the top of our lungs the most offensive claims we could come up with, so it was just a cacophony and nobody could make out what anyone else was saying, we would all enjoy parrhesia, right? Because we wouldn't have to fear retaliation for our speech because no one's paying attention, no one can, right? None of us would enjoy isagoria. None of our claims, whatever we're saying, are being taken up by others in conversation. And conversely, you can have a situation where people enjoy isagoria. They all have standing to have their speech heard and engaged with, but they don't have freedom from fear of retaliation. Imagine for some reason, the example that comes to mind is a scene from The Death of Stalin, where Stalin is at a dinner with his main like Politburo, and they're talking about something, and Stalin is listening very carefully to what everyone says. But it's also clear in that setting that that the members of the Politburo have a lot of reason to fear retaliation if they say the wrong thing. No. So you can imagine something like this. Imagine a meeting where we're trying to decide what to do. No, and everyone gets their say, and everyone's arguments and position is very, very carefully assessed and listened to and critiqued and discussed and evaluated. And at the end, there's a vote, and the losers get, kicked off the island, or, if you're Stalin, shot by the KGB, right? That would be a case where everyone in the conversation has isagoria, but no one has parrhesia. So these are really quite distinct from each other. And Teresa Bejan's point is like, you need both. And on a college campus, you really need both. You want them integrated with each other. And for me, I always come back to like, what do I want to see in the classroom? I want the classroom setting to be one where it's common knowledge among all of us, me and my students, that all members of the class enjoy both of these kinds of freedoms. That's not easy to engineer. It can definitely be done in a classroom setting, but it's not necessarily easy. And here might be a good place to just pause and mention something that's not in the slides. We hear a lot these days about viewpoint diversity and the importance of viewpoint diversity on college campuses. And I'm like, provided that viewpoint diversity, provided we spend enough time to understand what we do and should mean by that, I'm all in favor of it. But we can see that viewpoint diversity without freedoms of speech, without both, is not a particularly valuable thing, right? I fear too much that colleges have gotten to a place where if they have a diverse range of viewpoints, which Harvard actually does, what happens is that the people with those viewpoints sequester themselves and make sure that they only have to engage seriously with people whose viewpoints more or less overlap with their own. So there's no isagoria, no. There's no, you're like, at least across those boundaries, there's no willingness to hear and engage with contrary viewpoints. At least that's the worst manifestation of this. I actually don't think our problems are that severe, but there are definitely barriers to it. And in a classroom, I might lay down rules that says nobody is allowed to yell at anyone else for what they say, but that's not going to be enough if nobody listens to what anyone else says either, or takes it seriously. So you really, I can't overemphasize this. You really need parrhesia and isagoria integrated with each other seamlessly to have a well-functioning classroom. And especially to have a well-functioning classroom that's going to fulfill the ideal, the sort of anti-ignorance ideals I was laying out earlier. You also need to add that as kind of third leg of the three-legged stool, which is a kind of mutual sense of responsibility, that a well-functioning classroom should also feature a commitment to whatever the collective aim is in the classroom. And one of those aims, it's not the only aim, but whatever it is that I'm trying to accomplish with my students in the classroom, obviously it's to teach some material, to explore, in my case, philosophical questions. But it always, I think, needs to include the aim of helping each other get better at diagnosing, guarding against, and combating ignorance. Okay. And I think when both freedoms are in place and that shared commitment is in place, it's incredible what can happen. The classroom conversation becomes a powerful anti-ignorance tool, and it's also exciting and even joyful. The reason I add that point about it being exciting and even joyful is that sometimes I've found that conversations on our campus about dialogue across differences of opinion take the form of like finger wagging, you have to eat your spinach, tone to students. Like, look, you came to college, you may not like it, but you're going to have to encounter viewpoints that disagree with you and engage with them in good faith in a serious manner. And you just sort of need to like tough it out because it's good for you, And I think for some students, the initial experience with really serious, intellectually serious engagement with viewpoints that they feel are threatening is a bit like, okay, I guess I have to do this eating of my spinach. But when you get used to it, you discover it's incredibly exciting. I'm lucky to be in a group of philosophers. Like, philosophers love to argue with each other. Like we're at our happiest when we're disagreeing. So for me in that setting, I can sort of testify. Like, I get bored when I encounter like other philosophers who like agree with me too quickly. I want the contrary viewpoints because that's what makes it exciting. Okay, so let's zoom out a bit. So one thing I've been talking about the classroom, but one point to emphasize is that in an ideal college or university setting, the classroom won't just be the classroom. It'll be any setting in which serious conversation happens, including dining halls, like the houses, for example, even some extra like curriculars. I would say at Harvard, we're far from that ideal. And good question is why? That's one I think we can take up in more detail in our Q&A. And I mean, I'll start that bit of the conversation by saying that I think there have been social changes at the level of our students that have happened faster than faculty have been able to respond to. I don't mean to excuse our sort of inadequate response. I just think faculty tend to assume that the college experience is more or less like what it was for us back when we were college students. And that's not the case for all sorts of reasons right now. There are lots of pressures on young people experience have nothing to do with being in college, other kinds of pressures that make living up to this ideal like much more challenging than it was for us, social media being the most obvious of those pressures. And I think one thing that I find very hopeful is that my colleagues have noticed this now. Like we're like not in any doubt that there are problems, and that discussion has been going on for several years now. I guess if I could rewind time, I would say we should have started having those conversations about 20 years ago, if we could somehow have anticipated the kinds of changes we've seen. So at any rate, we're far from the ideal that I sketched. And it's not easy to build a community that lives up to those ideals. So these are the ideals that form the heart of what we mean at Harvard when we talk about intellectual vitality. When we talk about intellectual vitality, we talk about what we have in mind as a culture in which disagreement becomes an occasion for sort of leaning in and engagement, like good faith, intellectually serious, curiosity-driven engagement with the viewpoint you disagree with, and a culture that prizes that, a culture that builds the capacities in students and in ourselves as faculty to engage in that. It's difficult to build that culture because you can't do it in a top-down fashion by laying down rules. You can lay down some rules. So if we go back to the two kinds of freedom of speech, freedom from fear of reprisal for the content of what you say, and the freedom you enjoy when you have standing to have your ideas taken seriously, you can lay down rules that will protect the first of them, the parrhesia, to some extent, right? So you can lay down rules against certain kinds of character attacks. And I can certainly do that in my classroom, and that's easy. It's easy to say, like, look, we're hard to quote our outgoing dean of the college, we're hard on each other's ideas, but we're easy on each other. That's the way things roll in my classroom. It's not so easy to lay down rules that will prevent that when students are outside the classroom and interacting on social media. Okay, so even when it comes to protecting people from reprisal for the content of what they say, there's a limit to what rules can do. But rules can't help at all when it comes to isagoria. No. The sort of shared commitment that's required to treat differences of opinion as a good, as a kind of resource to be drawn on and taken advantage of in building our kind of collective wisdom and reducing our collective ignorance. You can't mandate that. I can't walk into the classroom and say, okay, everybody has to take everybody else's ideas seriously or else you get a failing grade. Like, there's no way to judge that. Like what students would do if I actually tried that, they would perform it. No, but they wouldn't actually be taking each other's ideas. They would just be performing in a way that, that they hoped would get their cranky professor to stop breathing down their necks, right? Instead, you have to build trust, and you don't do that by laying down rules. You have to build like solid norms instead. And that's a painstaking process. I think building them needs to be, so this is what I've just said, it needs to be bottom up, not top down. It requires a great deal of patience. It should involve equal input from all stakeholders. So students, administrators, sure, faculty, graduate students, partly because building strong norms goes hand in hand with building trust, and you don't build trust if you leave certain people out of the norm building conversations. And it demands a high degree of emotional awareness, emotional intelligence, and emotional self-regulation on the part of everyone. This, I will say, is another challenge for professors. We're not always good at because we're a bunch of nerdy academics. We live and breathe the sort of nerdy academic air. And in our scholarly work, in our research environments, the kind of emotion regulation or you need to both have and teach is not really so necessary. So there's a bit of sort of retraining of us as teachers. I think that's necessary for this to happen as well. So this is like what's happening, beginning to happen right now at Harvard in various different venues. The Intellectual Vitality Initiative is one. The Civil Discourse Initiative is another. I'm probably forgetting some too, but those are some of the more prominent ones. It's I think going to take a while. It's daunting. But it's definitely worth aiming at. For if we think about what we gain, if we sort of make it even part way towards like building a culture of intellectual vitality at Harvard, the institution will become much better at performing a really essential function, which is like the function of training students in the skills, knowledge, and habits of mind that they need to guard against and combat ignorance in themselves and in the groups to which they do and will belong. It's also, when we build this kind of environment, you build an environment that makes full use of its internal diversity. So going back to this phrase that we're hearing a lot of now about viewpoint diversity, we could have all the viewpoint diversity in the world at Harvard, but if we don't make use of it by sort of treating it as a resource that can only be exploited if people engage in a good faith, intellectually serious, curiosity-driven way across differences in viewpoint, then there's not really any point. Like viewpoint diversity per se is not a good. It's not an end in itself. It's a resource that can be exploited or leveraged for very good ends. So I think students, the more we can build this culture, the better equipped our students will be with the skills they'll need to flourish and contribute to a multicultural society. And college will honestly be more fun. So like to summarize, and this is where I'll end, I think the project now is for us collectively to learn to treat disagreement not as a threat, but as an opportunity. So as the kind of raw material out of which we collectively shrink our ignorance and grow our wisdom. Okay. So that's where I'll stop, and then we can launch into Q&A.
Fantastic. Well, thank you very much. That was interesting, and I think provocative in some of your diagnosis of what's going on here. Let me just start, and if people have questions, please enter them into the chat, and we can introduce them one by one. Let me just start by asking, when you think about what's caused this is maybe a problem that's crept up on everybody without fully expecting it, but it's here. When you think about what's caused it, do you think about is it a problem at the administration level? Is it a problem with the faculty? Is it a problem with the students? And then when you think about solving it, maybe a different answer. Where's the easiest way to solve this? Who's most receptive to ending anathematization, if that's I hear you about the difficulty of going about it, but what are the reactions of these three constituencies to the goals and the message you've got?
So starting going in reverse order and starting with that question, Neil, I would say one thing that makes me optimistic right now is that those three constituencies are pretty enthusiastic about the project. That doesn't mean it's easy. But when I talk to students, for example, undergraduates, I don't think I've had a conversation with a student where I've had many, like at this point, probably in the hundreds of conversations with students since I got to Harvard about the intellectual culture. And I've never encountered a student who said, yeah, no, I don't want to deal with viewpoints that disagree with me because those people are terrible. Now, they may censor themselves when they're talking to a faculty member. So I have to keep that in mind. But what I have encountered instead is a lot of interest in improving the culture, and often it starts out as disappointment. Like students, I remember a conversation with a student who helped start the Intellectual Vitality Initiative almost 4 years ago now, or actually almost 5 years ago now, who said, he had come to Harvard, hoping to have lots of stimulating conversations with fellow students who saw things very differently from how he did. And that just didn't happen. And I said, like, do you mean you never have those conversations? He said, oh, I do, just with carefully vetted friends, right? And I think when you talk to students about this, they will all agree, like, this is a problem and we don't like it, but we don't know on our own what to do about it. And some of this, I think, is a kind of, there's a collective action aspect to this. So one of our graduating seniors, not in philosophy, but in another program, but someone I've interacted with a bit, did his senior thesis project on this sort of issue of like, what's behind sort of self-censorship among students at Harvard, and found some interesting data in a survey he conducted that got between 500 and 600 responses, which is that Harvard students tend to report that they're very open to engaging with viewpoints that disagree with them. But when they're asked like, oh, and do you think your fellow students are as well? They say no, no. So there's a perception that their fellow students are not open in that way. And that's self-reinforcing, right? Like if you and I are students and I think like, well, I know Neil looks at things differently and like it might be fun to talk to him, but he probably won't, he's not going to want to. He's just going to be hostile. No. Or dismissive, then I might not take the risk because there would be some social risk, right? In sort of venturing forth and trying to engage you. So I think that's one dynamic. I think it's not so much that you have students who are like, come in like guns blazing, wanting to shut down viewpoints they disagree with. I think there are students like that, and especially at a place like Harvard, it can be a place to perform that kind of like, social justice warrior attitude. But it's not, I don't think it's that common. I think it's this more subtle dynamic accentuated by a general perception that it's risky to say something that will piss someone off because the anger or the pushback against you, the lashing out at you won't just be confined to the particular conversation you're in, but has a chance to like have a life on social media. Students report this concern constantly. My own guess is like the fear is overblown, but look, it only takes a few like vivid examples to generate that fear. Now, the same way people like, like if they hear there are sharks off the coast, they'll think, oh my God, don't go swimming. Because I heard a story once about someone getting eaten by a great white shark. You can give them the statistics that say like, this is not something you have to worry about. But vivid examples will tend to bias us. So I think there's some dynamics that reinforce self-censorship and partly driven by fear of social media repercussions. That's at the level of the students. I think at the level of the faculty, there has been fear of like, approaching, dealing with hot button topics in class, sometimes for similar reasons. You hear stories about cancellation or people getting like, in some kind of like trouble from their administrations. And especially if you're not tenured, you might think like, it's just not worth the risk. And here, I'll just be blunt. I think in the time I've been at Harvard, especially I would think in the last like 7 to 10 years, the administration kind of screwed up by having like bad policies about dealing with complaints. Because it could happen that you say something in class and some student complains because they don't like it. And there's, I think, too much of a tendency on the part of the administration to want to mollify students in cases like that, as opposed to say like, oh, you have a complaint, let's hear what it's about. Seems like this is what you signed up for coming to Harvard. So, on your way, and that might be because like, look, sometimes there are legitimate complaints. Like, the complaints students had about the behavior of Jorge Dominguez were like totally legitimate, but that's a completely different character, right? But if you have offices set up to handle one kind of student complaint, the ones that really should be taken seriously, and students use them to voice other kinds of complaints, well, you need to make sure that the people in those offices have a firm eye on the academic mission and on the importance of academic freedom so that they will know which complaints to take seriously and which ones to summarily dismiss. So I think that culture is changing at the administrative level, not a moment too soon. But that's that if you ask where there might be easy fixes, I think that one is like, we have better systems in place for managing complaints. So I think that one was like relatively easy. Changing the student culture is harder because we can't undo social media.
Got it. All right, a couple of questions from the audience. Alfredo Barrios says, I'm a free speech absolutist, but
Mhm.
I've recently been concerned with lending legitimacy to truly immoral ideas by engaging in debate about them in the mode you've been advocating. Is there
Mhm.
a moral dimension or moral veil assessment that needs to be added to this discussion equation?
That's a great question. I don't I don't feel like I have a, a good enough understanding of all the issues because I think that there can be settings where, and trying to engage in good faith with really sort of hateful views um, can be sort of like politically dangerous. I don't think the classroom is one of them. At least not if you've got good norms in place, like Chatham House rule, for example, in your classroom. But I think the uh, political debate in the public sphere might be one where we want, a narrower Overton window of like views that are sort of acceptable to take seriously there. Um, I'm not sure about that. I just think that, when you think of like the kinds of defenses, Millian defenses that, as in John Stuart Mill, that are given of free speech absolutism in the public sphere, they often seem to presuppose like too idealized a view about how argument and debate works in the public sphere. So I guess this is very far from a complete answer, Alfredo. But I would say I would want to distinguish the sphere within which speech is happening, and I think it's much more plausible that free speech absolutism is okay on a college campus, or at least in the classroom setting, than it is in the public setting. Now, again, in the classroom, if you have like, suppose you have a student who's like voicing a viewpoint that you think is morally distasteful, there's at least, as long as they're not trolling, that's a separate issue. But if they really mean it to be taken seriously, there's at least the opportunity to sort of engage them and sort of try to bring them around, and without feeling like the fact that you're doing so is causing any sort of political danger.
Okay. Tina Smith asks, I'm sorry, Michael Gardner, Tina Smith confirmed Michael Gardner's question, which is fire ranks Harvard last in terms of free speech. Is that correct?
God.
And I assume the question is, how does that feel correct to you?
Uh, oh my God. This is look, I love a lot of what Fire does. I think this is just so intellectually disreputable of them. Here's why. And you look up there's an article by Ryan Enos. I'll put his name in the chat. Or Neil, maybe you can, because I'm not going to figure out how to do it.
Sure.
Ryanenos. Who's a very like he's a friend of mine in the Gov department who's a like very expert social scientist, and he wrote a very, very good critique of Fire's methodology. And part of the methodology is fine as far as it goes. It's a survey. There are issues with sample bias, as with any survey, but there's still useful survey data about student attitudes and student self-censorship. But here's a way to sort of pithily say what's wrong with the rest of their methodology. Suppose you're a school that never invites a controversial speaker, and so never faces a threat of a controversial speaker's event being shut down by protesters, say, or hecklers. You will score high on that part of Fire's ranking. Suppose you're a school that invites 100 controversial speakers. And in 97 of those events, everything goes beautifully. People are respectful, there's serious engagement, lots of like good dialogue and back and forth. You get exactly the effect you want from having the speaker there. And 3 of the events are disrupted and shut down. You will score very, very badly on Fire's rankings. That is, they will notice the shutdowns. Their methodology does not give you any credit, and I mean zero, gives you 0 credit for those 97 successful events. So for example, when Tariq Masood a year ago had a speaker series where invited, fairly controversial people to speak about the Israeli-Palestinian conflict on both sides of it. No, that went off without a hitch. Fire does not credit us for that. So this is just genuinely pisses me off. I think they're doing this for clickbait, honestly.
Daniel Gill asks, is there an honor code? If yes, can it address attacking fellow students on social media?
That's really interesting. There is an honor code. It covers academic dishonesty, and was designed, God, I want to say at least 10 years ago, kind of before some of these issues really became kind of more talked about. I think that's worth considering. It would probably require some kind of process just because it's not built to do that right now. But it would be worth considering. I think it's a hard question how much policing you want to do. And honestly, I'm just thinking out loud now. But I think to build that into the honor code would be a way to send signals to the students that we as an institution consider it dishonorable to engage in certain kinds of social media attacks. And that itself might, might help quite a lot and reduce the need for enforcement. Because I think our students, by and large, they want to think of themselves as like decent, honest, high integrity students, but many of them come from a culture that does not single out, ridiculing someone on social media as a form of dishonorable behavior.
Okay.
So I think that's definitely worth considering.
Yeah, thanks. Valeria Barrett says, metaphorically speaking, claiming that spinach is good for everyone assumes a universal truth that may not apply across the board. Likewise, many regulations and rules, including those surrounding free speech, are based on hypotheses shaped by subjective experiences, perceptions, findings, and beliefs. The direction your topic is taking seems to rest on similarly broad assumptions. Consider this: the recent violence on campuses is viewed by some as an expression of freedom of speech. Are we truly comfortable with calling that kind of behavior freedom? Whose freedom is being protected and at what cost?
Can you say a bit more about what the violence you have in mind?
Valeria, do you want to unmute and expand a little bit?
I would like to just hear your take on that.
Okay. I mean, I think when I think about protecting Parisian Isagoria, there's no room at all in those protections for behavior that actively threatens another person. So I guess it's a virtue of sort of distinguishing those freedoms in the way that Teresa Bejan did, that it allows us to draw lines, some important lines, like, and say, look, when it comes to conduct towards other people, towards other students, that's not protected by a sort of, some blanket protection of freedom of speech. And this can get tricky when we're talking about protests, right? Because protests can be, you have to do some like very subtle and thoughtful line drawing between protest behavior that merely feels threatening to some members of the community, but isn't, versus protest behavior that genuinely is threatening. But I think that just saying we need free speech on campus is not, in a way, not relevant to how you do that, right? Because the question is really what kind of conduct, like when are you displaying hostility towards another person? But do you want to follow up on that?
I rather not go too deep into this topic, but I just wanted to see how you approach that dilemma.
Yeah, I mean, I can say a little bit more. If we're talking about protests in particular, I am all in favor of like time, place, and manner restrictions on protests. I think it's completely out of the question to allow protests in the classroom, for example. Like that to me is that's the kind of thing that should get someone sent to the ad board, and probably, I mean, I don't know how much you know about the disciplinary protocols, but the standard thing for serious infractions is kind of suspension for between, typically 1 or 2 semesters, No. So that would strike me as pretty serious, but also not something that you'd want to protect in the interests of like building a culture of intellectual vitality, right?
I just can add that I think freedom is a very dangerous word in a way that how you define it as a double sword, and the way we operate it as a tool and weapon in subjective agendas. That's what makes the whole difference in the world. And so that you mentioned exactly that it gets tricky. So therefore, that's the dilemma. As I said, I think that we don't really have an answer to this that would cover and benefit and resolve truly the issue.
I mean, not in the form of a kind of simple algorithm you can follow. Although for me, I think the trickiness is in, again, when we're talking about protests, or you know, say an interpersonal situation where two students are yelling at each other. The trickiness is in drawing a line between you know, behavior that counts as a genuine threat to one of the parties, versus behavior that doesn't, right? And we do need to recognize that you know, behavior that can feel threatening isn't thereby threatening. Like, again, like a lot of us can experience merely the voicing of an idea that we find really distasteful as threatening, but it's not. That's like, I'm not harming you if I voice an idea that you really, really don't like. I might well be harming you if I'm in your face screaming insults at you, right? And there absolutely will be judgment calls, you know, about how to draw that line, but that feels like less an issue about freedom and more an issue about how do we understand harm.
Thank you. I'm cognizant of the time, so let me ask one more question and then we'll let you go. I appreciate it's later in Boston or Cambridge than it is here. So I heard you talk about how groups can create cognitive blind spots by, you know, shoving potential answers off stage. And the first thing that came unbidden into my mind was the Harvard faculty tenure process. And maybe that's fair, maybe that's not fair. You can comment on that. But what is the role for the faculty to demonstrate the behavior that you want to see from the students? I mean, where is the active engagement of different points of view, of argument and debate at the faculty level? Isn't that something that should be encouraged and, you know, and performatively? You know, do you have those? Wouldn't students want to see that and that? Isn't that a route?
And actually, there is a kind of thing we could do that in some ways is low-hanging fruit, which is more co-teaching of topics and material by faculty who take different viewpoints on it. And that definitely happens. And but it could be actively promoted by the administration. It's costly, you know, in terms of resources, but I think for the reasons you just indicated, Neil, it's absolutely worth it. You know, like right now, what can happen with faculty is like we'll engage with each other and argue with each other, but often within our disciplinary boundaries, because like we don't necessarily like, you know, I expect I could have like really interesting, like productive arguments with people in the econ department, but there's just not like we get busy and there's not like formalized occasions for doing so. But one such occasion could be, you know, co-teaching, making that much more widespread. And it happens to some extent, and every story I've heard has been good. You know, when faculty co-teach with other faculty who disagree with them, because like, look, if you get me and someone who I disagree with in a classroom together, teaching some material where we see it differently, our professional instincts are going to kick in. We're going to know better than just like bicker with each other in the classroom. And that, I think, when students see that live, it's incredibly powerful, right? Because they see like, oh, this is what it looks like to have a really good argument to debate where the two of you are clearly treating each other with utmost respect and clearly not going to converge on a single opinion. So I would say, practically speaking, the best mechanism for generating the kind of exchanges you have in mind would be co-teaching.
Like it. All right. Well, look, on behalf of everybody who could attend, really appreciate it. The event's been recorded, so it's going to be available to club members for the foreseeable future. And I know people take advantage of that too. Want to thank you for spending your time with us this evening. It's been really terrific, and we wish you the best
Well,
for the institution and for yourself too.
yeah, fingers crossed. Thanks for the invitation. Thanks to everyone. And if there are questions you want to ask me, feel free to reach out by email. I'm happy to continue the discussion.
All right. Thank you, Professor Hall. Thank you for everybody for attending.
Take care.
Bye-bye.